So. Hey, thanks. Welcome. I'm going to talk about decoupling persistence, and mostly that maybe you shouldn't couple your models to your persistence layers, like maybe they not necessarily need to inherit from active record. My name is Piotr. This is my handle. If you don't know what Mendicant University is, you should disregard this talk and just click on the link and or Google it and get reading. This is an awesome community that I was able to pass the exam for, and then that was the most awesome course that I had, so learned about it. I work at the Warsaw University of Technology. If you remember that handsome guy who was on half of Nick's slides, Alex here, he got to be an engineer despite me being his supervisor. And I also I am self-proclaimed CSO at a Warsaw-based consultancy, Ruby and Rails consultancy. I just got delivered a bottle of scotch from one of our clients. So we supposedly are good enough. I also coordinate events for IT and NGO nonprofit organization sector. So how do we create a Rails app or a Ruby web app nowadays? Well, we install the obvious parts. Then we install MySQL because we obviously need it. Then we install a JavaScript runtime because that's what you need for a Ruby web application. We don't need to install Vim because we have it already, and we use it because it's the most awesome editor. If you haven't been to yesterday's Vimcast workshop, you really missed out. There was some scotch there as well. So what do we do? Let's say we want to have a website. The print media is getting really large now, so let's say we want to have a website for a new paper, the Truth. We create the Rails app. We added the database to point it at MySQL. We added the gem file to uncomment the Ruby Racer. And then we generate our first model, our second model. We run rake db migrate. And then we start editing tests if we're into this kind of thing. So this is basically what I think every one of us did at some point, and some of us believe this is the way applications should be built. Uncle Bob Martin said if the first thing you type when writing a Ruby app is Rails, you've already lost the architecture game. You can agree, you can disagree with Uncle Bob Martin and his architecture talk. But I think there's some truth to that. Maybe we should, if we switch away from Uncle Bob Martin and more towards a grumpy elder people like me or Professor Farnsworth, maybe there is some truth that we should probably think about architecture before we decide even on the framework we use. So why are we so obsessed with the database layer? Why do we need databases? We basically believe that our objects are the core of the things we build, and we want time travel for those objects. We basically want them to persist. We want to use them over and over again. We want to be really sure that they'll be back there when we reboot. And for some reason, we want this persistence straight up from the start rather than at some point eventually when we actually have some client data that we're going to persist and that we should actually persist. So what's the problem with the databases? A database is a black hole into which you put your data. If you're lucky, you'll get it back again. If you're very lucky, you'll get it back in a form you can use. Database for persistence should be an implementation detail. That's one of the notions you might or might not to subscribe to. But not necessarily this must be the first thing that you use. And there are a couple of quirks to a couple of databases that we all know about. It looks like you're creating a database. Most likely you'd like it in Latin 1 encoding with Swedish collation. It's obviously speaking on one particular database. But maybe we shouldn't bother with databases so early in the process of creating an app. There are 3 funny pictures in this talk that I used before, which I feel very bad about. But they are very to the point. And this one says, of course, the black zebras with white stripes hated the white zebras with black stripes just as much. There are virtues and vices to various database systems. Maybe we really shouldn't pick one before we know what we want to build. And the vast spectrum of databases we can pick up from MySQL, PostgreSQL, SQLite if we have a small app. There is embedded version of SQLite if we want to run in a virtual machine, for example, and we want to persist the whole machine rather than persist the data. CouchDB, MongoDB document databases, there's an embedded version of MongoDB, so we don't even need to, for example, for our tests to run against MongoDB, we can run against an embedded version. There is an in-memory Redis. There's a Redis object collection. If you don't know it, you should try it as Ruby objects for Redis data. There are graph databases for stuff like social networks and proximity searches. There are directory services. If you want to manage login to your web app that is shared across different web apps, LDAP might be like the good thing to look into. And there's YAML records for active record or active model-like approach to YAML files, if that's what you need. There's pstore, which is my favorite standard Ruby library. It gives you persistence of objects for free right there. If you're writing a small app that you might be the sole user of, maybe you should look into pstore rather than believing that I really need SQLite for that. So there are also object databases. Maglev got released, if you don't know what Maglev is. It's a Ruby VM built in a very small talk-like manner that has its own persistence of objects. Madeleine is a great, Andrzej smiles, as the author. It's a way of persist objects in, I think, Java's prev-layer or Java-ish prev-layer manner, or using that. Cubehole, it's a lovely project that persists your objects in Unix-like standard. Look into it. And Martin Fowler said, now that people are considering NoSQL, will more people consider no database? Really, persisting might not be the first thing you should use. And even if you want to persist really early, maybe you should think where you would like to persist it. There's a wonderful Martin Fowler presentation that I shamelessly stole a screen of. This is various database systems and various parts of your application they might be useful for. The slides will be online, so you can read it in detail later. But basically, polyglot persistence. A lot of data can be stored in a very particular kinds of data storages. And maybe you shouldn't decide upfront which one you're going to use for all of your data. So what does splitting models and persistence give us? That's one more quote that was actually a motto for this presentation. When I open up Rails projects and the models there is full of 100% active record classes, I shudder. Model does not equal persistence. And the other one is we need something better. Persistence and logic are two separate responsibilities that every Rails app combines. So we really shouldn't assume for granted. We might decide that that's like, we have a very small, simple application. We do know that it's going to run on MySQL. We do know that active record is the best one. Sure, go with model tied to your database objects. But maybe that's not always the best solution. So what would be the benefits of splitting? Well, first, backend independence. You can move some of your models to one backend, some other to a different backend. No shortcuts, explicit shortcuts. If you go with persisting right off the bat, you sometimes take shortcuts that basically say, oh, I know this database that I'm using supports this, so I'm just going to use it implicitly. And then when you try to switch a database engine, suddenly you figure out that there was a shortcut that you were abusing that you didn't explicitly had in your system. Explicit shortcuts, on the other hand, if you go with PostgreSQL has a coordination data type. You can say that this table cell holds geo coordinates, and you can ask the database, if you add some geo stuff to this, you can add Postgres, ask, give me all the people who are in a 5-kilometer radius around that particular coordinates. You can offload this to the database. If you have this right in your model layer, you might miss it when you switch engines. If you have this implemented in your persistence layer, then persistence for Postgres would have this. But if you are switching engines, you will know that you have re-implement geolocation because that was taken care of by the database. Easier modeling. Arguably, especially if you read Objects on Rails from Avdi Grimm, which I really encourage you to do, it's much easier to model your objects when you don't think constantly about the persistence beneath. And it's somewhat more future-proof if you do it this way, because it's easier to switch persistence layers if it's a separate layer. So the tests are cleaner and simpler. They actually test objects, not your domain objects. They run abysmally fast. I mean, it's really nice to not have to bring up the whole Rails stack just to test your models. You test the persistence separately. If that's a very thin driver that just basically says, this model, map it one-to-one to database, it's very easy to test. But when it grows, it's still much better to test it separately rather than by testing your models in a unit test manner. You should have integration tests probably, but maybe not necessarily unit test the persistence. And Rails is not your app, don't unit test it. Basically, if your models inherit from active record, you basically test active record. And they also get all kinds of stuff like the whole find protocol, which is somewhat hard to test if you want to test it extensively. There are a lot of options to find, and it's hard to test it extensively. So what could be the vices of this? Well, performance, you should check it. You should think about it upfront if you think that might be a problem. If you do a lot of abstraction, performance might creep in as a liability. Perceived complexity. It's much easier to work upfront, at least one might think so. It's much easier to work on active record-based models because they're obvious. We use them every day. But maybe if you model it just the right way, maybe it might be doable to do the separation of persistence in a way that is easily graspable. And it might not be that big of an overhead for a new developer. You ain't going to need it. That's a serious question, whether you really should even think about it. But you usually have a vague idea whether you want this app to be a big one or just a small project. And NullDB is a very nice library from Avdi Grimm that separates the whole active record going to the database part. So try it out if you don't want to have a separate persistent layers, but maybe want to make your tests faster and less brittle. So the last thing that I think is a good argument for this is that it's object-oriented. Your models, your domain models, should have very clean-cut responsibilities. Persisting themselves might not be exactly the responsibility you want to give to each one of them. So Avdi wrote, the biggest reason, scratch that, the only reason is to make our apps easier to change. The only constant in life is change, and that goes double for software projects. Rails is reaching a point at the time of writing where a lot of projects are starting to mature, and a lot of developers are realizing their projects aren't nearly as easy to modify as they used to be. This allows you to modify your projects easier. Attempts to predict which parts of code base will need to change and to structure accordingly have ended badly more often than not. Part of the nature of change is that you often don't know beforehand what is going to need change. Much like premature optimization, premature change management usually misses the mark. So it can be, of course, understood both ways, but think whether a very thin persistent layer won't make it easier for your projects to change. And we know that projects change even when we don't notice this explicitly. They do change a lot, and you think about the project you work on from a year ago, it did look differently. So how do we do the separation? And it's a very big topic, and there are various ways to do that, to move persistence away from your domain models. Basically, the idea is to move as much logic out of data objects, where data objects are the thing that you do persist. That's one way of doing that. Decorators are a good example, because if you have in your models like 2 JSON methods or 2 XML methods, then they also are responsible for representing themselves as a sum representation. And maybe this should be done with, say, decorators or Rabble or something like that. Composition is another thing that might be interesting. If you compose your domain objects, if you really want them to actually be responsible for persistence, you can compose them from a part that does the persistence, is quite universal, and the part that does the thing that the model actually should be responsible for. And the last example is DCI, which I won't go into big detail because I'm only starting to wrap my head around it. You should go to Andrzej for all the details, and Nick, definitely. But I will just show a quick example, quick enough to make fun of me of how I did not understand it. But there's a link to an article that explains it probably much better. So decorators, that's like the simplest thing. If you want to move some part of your domain object's responsibility away, using a decorator might be very convenient. Turning a model into something that you pass to a view, or if you don't want to use per-class helpers, which a lot of Rails uses and are not always the best thing to do. And you should definitely, if you want to try out decorators, read up on Draper. But I'm going to show a very simple example of a decorator with a standard library, simple delegator, which is a class that wraps around a given object and lets you decorate it easily. So let's say we have an address class, and it's either persisted or we only model it. So we give it an active record-like API. So basically, we have accessors, and we can initialize with a hash. And then we want to display this address in a way that Polish addresses are usually displayed: street, postcode, city, and then country on a separate line. So we might want to have a class that is a Polish address, which will be a decorator for the address class that has a formatted method. And that method calls, as you see, street, postcode, city, and country methods that are on that object. So for this to work, all you need to do is just inherit from simple delegator, initialize that with a supercall to the simple delegator passing the object, and then the Polish address has all the methods of the object it wraps. So if you want to have an object that has certain responsibilities in a given, let's say, view context, going with a decorator might be a good thing. So we can create an address. We can create a Polish address that just wraps it. And then if we call country on that, it will be Poland, because the simple delegator will delegate that to that other address. And when we call formatted, then we get the formatted version of the address. So basically, you can easily move the data part of your object away and just have a data object that is, for example, one-to-one with persistence, and then have the logic that you needed to put in that model when you usually did it the regular way, in a business object, behavior object, however you want to call them. And the bonus is that there's ease of testing. You basically test the behavior. You can inject any object. You can inject OpenStruct and just make sure it works. And reuse, if you have formatters for different kinds of stuff that work the same, you can actually reuse them easily. The other thing I want to show is composition over inheritance. There is a very disputable quote: inheritance is a code smolder. I said it. I don't think I agree fully, especially given the simple delegator inheritance that we saw. But there might be something to the fact that we abuse inheritance. If you look at Rails 4 code base, the active record might be mixed in rather than inherited from. So maybe your domain objects do not need to inherit from stuff. Maybe they can be composed of a part that does the persistence and the part that actually does the real work from their point of view. So you can compose domain objects from data objects. And again, I will show a very simple example from a standard library from Ruby. Ruby is chock full of wonderful libraries. You should really go at some lazy afternoon, go through the list of standard libraries and see what's in there. Forwardable lets you do things like this. Let's say we have an address object like before, and a very similar person object with a given names and surname. And just a quick tangent: if you have first name and last name in your database, it's really suboptimal. There's a lot of context, cultural context, when people do not have first name and last name in the way you would expect it. Like Hungarian people have those switched. The Icelandic people have a different idea. of what is a first name, what is a last name. So if you really need to have this split, try going with given names and surname, or maybe your people objects. And we are one of the only two industries this is a quote from Paul Butley. There are only two industries that refer to their customers as users, and we're one of those industries. So maybe you should have a person object when you talk about people, and have a user object when you talk about like a bot who can use your system, not necessarily a person, but a person as well. But there should be a distinction between a person and a user. So please do read personal names around the world. This is one of the ways to go with first name and last name. I mean, this would be better than first name and last name, but end of tangent. So we have two basic data domain objects, and we want to have say a Polish envelope address. And we can compose it very easily from passing the person and address as values in a hash. And then we want to format it like this. So again, we create a simple formatter that calls given name, surname, street, postcode, city, and country on this object. And we do this by simply requiring forwardable and defining a couple of delegators. This is a very easy way to compose your objects into something that has all the features, or some of the features that you want of the objects that are below. So you can create a person, create an address, create a Polish envelope address out of it. And then on this Polish envelope address, you have a surname method, a city method, and you can put a formatted version that is a logic that is strictly presentational. And what I'm trying to say is that maybe if you want to have a domain object that has persistence inside, maybe it should have a persistence part that is, for example, injected like that. So domain models compose from data models. Persistence could be a component that is injected like that. You can inject something that has a save method and expose it through forwardable. And yeah, so you can dependency inject it. It's easier to test this stuff when it's partitioned. And the last thing, DCI, this is where I get into the very shaky, for me, waters. The data plus context plus interaction. One of the ideas is that the data objects hold only data. And they might be one-to-one with persistence. It might be a good idea to try it out like this for starters, if you want to try it out. And then you have a parallel behavior that you mix in to a given data object to have it become a given domain object in your system. And the example I came up with is if you have, again, a person address, and you have roles like landlord, who can rent a place at a given address and to a given person. And let's say you have a code that checks whether that person is credible. So credibility is a feature of a tenant. It's a tenant credibility whether a given person can have enough money, is not drinking too much, which would rule most of us out. And this is a role, and both of those roles are roles of person object. And the same person can be a landlord in one scenario and a tenant in another. So the other part is context, and a context is something that you execute. And let's say you initialize the context with an address and two people. You extend one of the people with the landlord role, the other with the tenant role, and then when you execute the context in Ruby lingo, call seems like the best idea to name it. You can do all kind of things, and at some point you can say landlord, rent a place at address to tenant, and that tenant will have a credible method because he's a person who is a tenant, and that landlord will have a rent a place method because he's a person who in this context is a landlord. So I don't know whether I got this any year right. Approved. Whoa, cool. So yeah, basically, you have an address, person A, person B. You might get it from your controller. You might get it elsewhere if it's not necessarily need to be a web app, obviously. And then you create a renting context that you pass the address and two people, and then you call it, and it does the magic. So what I get from DCI is that it's not really about splitting out persistence. It's a different architectural idea, that you have separate data and separate behavior. And then you marry it in a way that you, for that data, you give that behavior, and you execute it in this given context. And you should really read the right way to code DCI in Ruby, and then you should go and read all of Andrzej's blog and all of Nick's blog and Jim's, right? So whether this is beautiful or not to you depends on what you find beautiful or not. There are certain details. It's a police car. There are certain details that might appeal to you, and definitely you should try this out. So the last thing I want to show, which is going way overboard, maybe, is treating your web app as, or any other app, as sole objects, and hide the persistence altogether. And there are two examples that I love. One is Candy, the other is Ambition. And this is a way to treat persistence in a very invisible manner. So Candy is a way of doing transparent persistence in MongoDB. You can, and it's going to be 5 lines, I think. You require Candy. You create your conference class that creates conference objects. You include Candy piece in there, and this is your persistence for free. When you instantiate a new conference object, what it does in the background, it connects to localhost if it's not specified and it didn't connect before. It connects to a database that is the same as your username if you didn't configure it. I mean, literally, this is all that you need, those 4 lines. And then creates a new conference collection if you didn't configure it differently, and saves a new object there. This all happens through include Candy piece. There's a very thin border between genius and madness. I think Candy dances all around that border. But you should try it. And you can just call any method. And location wasn't defined here. So Candy, through some method missing magic, takes care of it and saves that object with that property, saves it. Then you create a hash. There is a party today. If you don't know, you really should come to it. And then at this point, Candy resaves that object, and then you can access that like this. As I said, it's a very, very crazy approach that is lovely to look at. Probably you can learn a lot by looking how this is done. This is persistent that is totally invisible. There is a kids Ruby project that was very, very interested in that. Because when you teach people programming, the last thing you want to teach them about is how to persist upfront. And the other thing I wanted to show is Ambition, which lets you do persistent queries in Ruby syntax without knowing that it's an SQL store and you do find by SQL or something like this. You basically require the right adapter, let's say for active record. And then you can do this. This is a typical Ruby select query that says, give me all the people who can drink tonight. If they are American, well, to flag. But if they are not, then there's hope that they can be younger and drink with us. And what it does behind, it turns that into this SQL query. But this is because we used the right adapter. If we instead use the LDAP adapter, which is, as you can see, the differences in what we required and what we inherit from, this is exactly the same. And this is the LDAP query that is executed by Ambition. I think there is a data mapper Ambition adapter. So if you're using data mapper, you get Ambition very easily as well. So these all are things that I personally find very interesting and funny, and a different way of doing stuff that we are used to. And I don't know, you should just play with it. And the ideas that I wanted to show is that maybe you shouldn't drive your design with Rails generate model. Maybe you should check out various ways to persist objects. Maybe you should try pstore for your small pet project. Learn about your persistence layers feature. In PostgreSQL, which is my favorite relational database, you can have a column that holds arrays. So when you have blog posts, you can say that the tags are in that array, and this blog post can be about Ruby and persistence, that other about Ruby, that third about persistence, and you can ask PostgreSQL, give me the blog post about Ruby, and it will find that information from inside those arrays. So do think whether or not to disassociate models from persistence. Play with decorators, composition, DCI, or the other things that come to your mind. And please do read personal names around the world. And that's the second funny picture that I keep reusing. This is what I picture when I think about us engineers. Play with it. Come up with ideas. Have fun. Thank you. The questions stand between you and the lunch, so I will be the one to be blamed, but if you have any, then go ahead, and if not, you can find me afterwards. No questions, too abstract.
You can ask the questions maybe during lunch?
Yep. So for the reading, the slides are here. Do skip your next 2 coffees and buy a $5 book from Avdi Grimm, which is absolutely awesome. Watch Uncle Bob's talk. You might disagree with it, but do watch it. There is a great article by Piotr Szotkowski about making active record models thin. The presentation from Martin Fowler, a great Ruby Rocks podcast that you should check out. And there's a hackathon next weekend in Warsaw that I co-organize if you want to come and help organizations, non-profit foundation do really, really awesome stuff. We had one in December. It was really great. Do come to Warsaw. Find me. And the third picture. I'll be around. I'm wearing red like Santa Claus to hide the bloodstains. So do find me and enjoy the party. Thank you.